Lillian sat at the head of the dinner table, her gaze drifting across the room filled with family and close friends. The soft glow of the chandelier above bathed the room in warm light, casting long shadows across the polished wood of the dining table. It was meant to be a celebration, a marker of the years she had dedicated to the company, the years she had sacrificed. But tonight, the atmosphere felt colder than it should have. Her son, Ethan, sat across from her, his face half lit by the flickering candlelight, the sharp angles of his features giving him an almost predatory look. He was talking to Jessica, his confidant and one of the company's top executives, his voice loud enough to reach across the table. "Can you believe it?" Ethan's voice rang out, a hint of amusement in his tone. "Mom's retirement party. I thought it'd be a bit more, well, significant." His laugh was cold, cutting through the warmth of the room like a knife. Jessica, ever eager to play along, raised her glass. "I'm sure the company will do just fine without her," she chimed in, her words dripping with sarcasm. "After all, it's not like you've had any real leadership issues since she stepped down." Her eyes flickered toward Lillian, a faint smirk playing at the corners of her lips. Lillian's stomach tightened, the sting of their words sharper than she expected. She had braced herself for this moment, but nothing could have prepared her for the cruel mockery of her son, the one person she had worked her whole life to nurture and empower. "Just retired," Ethan muttered, his voice carrying a tone that dismissed the decades of sacrifice she had poured into the company. "It's funny. You'd think there'd be more fanfare for something that, well, doesn't really mean much." Lillian's hands, resting lightly on the table, clenched imperceptibly. The hurt washed over her, but she didn't let it show. She wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing her react. Instead, she pressed her lips together, staring into her glass of wine as if it held all the answers to the unspoken rift between them. David, seated at the far end of the table, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His gaze flickered briefly from Lillian to Ethan, the tension in the air palpable. He had worked with Lillian for years, seen the blood, sweat, and tears she had put into every aspect of the business. But tonight, even he couldn't find the words to stop Ethan. Ethan, oblivious to the weight of his mother's silence, continued, his voice filled with a mixture of arrogance and entitlement. "I mean, we'll manage," he said, nodding toward Jessica. "The business will flourish now. We've got this. I'm sure of it. It's just a matter of time before things get back on track without her holding the reins." Lillian's jaw tightened, but she kept her composure, silently reminding herself that this moment, this dinner, was only a blip in the grand scheme of things. She had built this company from the ground up. She could handle a little ridicule from her son. But the sting of his words, the dismissiveness, the undercurrent of superiority gnawed at her insides. She took a deep breath, forcing her gaze back to her plate. It was no use engaging now. She had seen too much of this behavior from Ethan over the years to believe that a confrontation would do anything but escalate the tension. Jessica's voice pierced the silence again, each word calculated and cold. "Besides," she added, her eyes narrowing slightly as she leaned in, "I'm sure the business will only get stronger now that Ethan's taking charge. After all, the old ways aren't always the best, are they?" David shifted in his chair, his eyes flicking between Lillian and Ethan, but he remained silent. He knew better than to intervene. This was a family matter, and he could see that Lillian, as always, was holding herself together with a strength that only she possessed. Ethan smirked, clearly reveling in the discomfort he was causing. "Exactly," he said, raising his glass in mock salute toward Lillian. "We'll be just fine. No need for the nostalgia, just a new chapter for all of us." Lillian's heart squeezed in her chest. Her son's arrogance, the way he had completely dismissed everything she had worked for, was more painful than she had anticipated. The table felt smaller now, as if the walls of the room were closing in on her. The air around her seemed thick, suffocating. But she remained silent, her face an unreadable mask. She would not let them see her weakness. Not now, not in front of them. The conversation shifted, the clinking of silverware on plates filling the space that had once been thick with tension. But Lillian remained lost in her thoughts. the sting of Ethan's words still echoing in her mind. The dinner continued, but Lillian knew, deep down, that this was not just a passing moment. This disrespect was the beginning of something far more significant. And as she sat there, her heart heavy with the weight of betrayal, a quiet resolve began to build within her. She would not let this go. Ethan and Jessica might think they had won tonight, but Lillian knew something they didn't. The real game had just begun. Lillian stood in the silence of the living room, the flickering fire casting long shadows across the walls. The warmth of the flames did little to ease the cold knot that had settled in her chest. She had expected some discomfort, some tension from Ethan, but this outright dismissal of her life's work, it hurt in a way she hadn't anticipated. Her son's voice still echoed in her mind. Just retired. As if all she had done, everything she had built, meant nothing. The business, her legacy, it was all suddenly reduced to a title. The air around her felt heavy, suffocating, as she replayed the cruel words over and over. The fire crackled, but the sound was muted, drowned out by the swirl of her thoughts. Why had he changed so much? She had always known Ethan had an edge to him, an ambition that, while impressive, was tempered by his respect for the foundation she had laid. But now it was as if he barely saw the company as anything more than his birthright. A quiet knock on the doorframe broke her reverie. David stood in the doorway, his expression soft with concern. He had been there during the dinner, silent, observing the way Ethan's words had cut through the room like glass. He knew her better than anyone, and yet there had been nothing. No intervention, no support. "Lillian," his voice was low, hesitant. "You holding up all right?" She turned to him, forcing a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm fine, David. Just fine." David stepped into the room, looking at her with a mixture of sympathy and caution. "I know you're not fine. I saw what happened," Lillian exhaled, running a hand through her hair. "It's not just what happened tonight, it's been building, Ethan. He doesn't see it. He doesn't understand what it took to build this company, what I sacrificed." Her voice wavered slightly, but she fought to keep it steady. "All those years, all that effort, and now I'm just retired. As if I've done nothing. As if I'm nothing." David shifted, unsure of how to respond. "Lillian, Ethan has grown the company. He's done good work. You taught him well. You can't deny that." Her eyes narrowed. "Good work? He's been handed everything. He never had to scrape, never had to fight for what he got. He's never had to wake up at 2 a.m. and wonder how he's going to keep the doors open. I did that. Not him." David's eyes softened, but he said nothing. He had always been a loyal friend, a confidant, but even he wasn't sure how to navigate this. Lillian stepped toward the window, looking out into the dark night. "I've worked my entire life for this company, for the future of this family. And now he thinks I'm just something to be discarded? He doesn't get it. He doesn't get me." David watched her, seeing the fire ignite in her eyes. "What are you going to do?" Lillian turned slowly, her face hardening with resolve. "I'm not going to let this slide. He will understand what it means to build something from the ground up. He will understand the value of everything I've worked for." Her voice was cold, steady. "I'm not finished yet." The weight of her words settled between them, heavy and final. She wasn't going to sit back and let her legacy be erased. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The early morning light filtered through the curtains, casting soft beams across the study where Lillian sat hunched over her desk, the quiet hum of the city outside barely registering in her mind. The room was meticulously organized, just like the company she had built. She had spent years perfecting every detail, each decision made with the precision of a master craftsman. But today, the papers in front of her felt different. The spreadsheets, the financial reports, the annual summaries all seemed like pieces of a puzzle she hadn't yet fully solved. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, her mind racing through the thoughts that had kept her awake the night before. Ethan's words, still sharp in her memory, pushed her to a place she hadn't anticipated. Just retired. How could he have dismissed everything like that? She had spent her entire life creating something meaningful, something that could outlast her. And now, here she was, feeling invisible in her own company. Lillian tapped the keyboard, bringing up the company's financial reports, the ones she had reviewed countless times over the years. The numbers blurred for a moment, but she quickly refocused, scrolling through the figures with a practiced eye. There was nothing overtly alarming, nothing that screamed crisis, but there were signs, small ones of complacency, inefficiency in key areas. She frowned as she noticed an uptick in expenses in departments that had previously been efficient, areas where Ethan had made changes. And then, there was Jessica. Lillian's eyes narrowed as she saw the growing influence Jessica seemed to have over the company. Decisions that had once required careful consideration and collaboration were now being made by Jessica alone. Ethan, once so involved in the operations of the business, had begun to defer to her in almost every major decision. Lillian leaned back in her chair, tapping the pen against her lip. The shift in the company's leadership wasn't just about the numbers. It was about the power dynamics that had begun to shift, subtly but undeniably. Ethan was relying more and more on Jessica, allowing her to pull the strings in his stead. He had become complacent, letting someone else take charge while he focused on growing his personal brand and prestige. It was time to act. She pushed the reports aside and pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. Her pen scratched across the page, drafting a plan she had kept in the back of her mind for some time. It wasn't just about financial strategy, it was about reclaiming control over the direction of the company. Lillian's eyes darkened as she wrote, outlining the changes she would implement. Ethan would be reassigned, no longer the figurehead he had become. Jessica? She would be removed from her position, her influence curtailed. There was a quiet satisfaction in the process. She had been patient, too patient, perhaps. Now it was time to remind them all who had built this company, and who still held the reins. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard again, drafting a letter that would notify Ethan and Jessica of the changes that were about to unfold. The words came easily, the tone cold but professional. No room for argument. No room for doubt. She hit send, the soft click of the mouse echoing in the room. Lillian sat back, her fingers resting on the edge of the desk as she gazed out the window. The city sprawled beneath her, the skyscrapers gleaming in the early light, just like the legacy she had built. It was a legacy that was no longer going to be tossed aside, no longer going to be forgotten. But as she sat there, a strange feeling settled over her. The decision had been made. It was no longer about holding on to power for herself, it was about ensuring that the company, the business she had fought for, would remain true to its values, its foundation. Ethan may have thought he was entitled to it all, but she was about to teach him otherwise. The sound of footsteps behind her interrupted her thoughts. David had entered the room, his presence as quiet as ever. He had been so perceptive in the past, always knowing when something was wrong. But this time, there was something different about the way he watched her. "You're making a move," he said, his voice steady but tinged with concern. "I can see it in your eyes." Lillian turned toward him slowly, a small but determined smile playing on her lips. "Yes, it's time." David's gaze lingered on her for a moment, searching for something he couldn't quite pinpoint. "And Ethan? Jessica?" Lillian's smile didn't waver. "They'll understand soon enough." David remained silent, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied her. He knew better than to push further. But something in Lillian's expression, something in the way she held herself, made him uneasy. This wasn't just about a business decision anymore. This was something far more personal. And Lillian was ready for the consequences. The air in the law office was sterile, cold, a stark contrast to the heat rising inside Lillian. She sat across from Jonathan Hayes, her legal advisor, her fingers drumming anxiously on the arm of the chair. The decision was made, but the gravity of it settled on her like a weight. This wasn't just about the company, it was about her legacy, her life's work, and reclaiming control. Jonathan shuffled through the thick stack of documents, his movements precise and methodical. "You're in a strong position," he said, glancing up from the bylaws. "You still hold significant power in the company's structure. You have the authority to make these changes." Lillian nodded but didn't speak. She had built this empire from the ground up, and now it felt as if her son, Ethan, had casually pushed it aside. His lack of respect, his reliance on Jessica, it had all been building for years, and tonight had been the breaking point. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, adjusting his glasses. "But Lillian, you need to be careful. Removing Ethan, especially given his position, will create ripples. A lot of people will ask questions. Are you prepared for that? Lillian's gaze was unwavering. I've been prepared for years. Her voice, though quiet, carried with it the certainty of someone who had made up their mind long ago. Ethan's entitlement, Jessica's scheming, it had all led to this. She wouldn't stand by and watch the business she built crumble into something unrecognizable. The company wasn't just Ethan's by right. It was hers by blood, sweat, and sacrifice. Jonathan picked up his pen, his eyes studying her intently. We'll need to draft a formal letter for the board. Notify them of the changes. You'll need a plan in place for how you'll communicate this to Ethan and Jessica. This is going to be a shock. I know, Lillian replied, her voice hardening. But it's a shock they need. Jonathan tapped his pen on the table thoughtfully. The legal ramifications will be tricky, but we can manage it. We'll make sure it's airtight. Lillian's mind was already several steps ahead. The legalities, the strategies, all of it was secondary to what had to be done. She couldn't afford to hesitate. Too much had been lost already. The conversation turned to logistics, timelines, and how to proceed without raising suspicion. Lillian's resolve never wavered. She wanted this done swiftly, decisively. The longer she waited, the more control she lost. David's unexpected entrance interrupted her thoughts. He stood in the doorway, watching her with an unreadable expression. So, you're moving forward? He asked quietly. Lillian met his eyes, her expression steely. It's time. David's gaze lingered for a moment longer before he walked over, his presence comforting, yet charged with an unspoken tension. And Ethan? Jessica? They'll understand soon enough, she said, a cool finality in her voice. David didn't respond, but the silence between them spoke volumes. She wasn't just taking control of the company anymore, this had become personal, and even he, who had stood by her for so long, could sense the storm brewing. The decision had been made, but as Lillian stood to leave, she felt the weight of the next step hanging over her. Ethan would never see it coming, and neither would Jessica. But this was only the beginning. Lillian stood at the head of the boardroom table, the weight of her decision settling around her like a storm cloud. The room was still, every eye fixed on her as she cleared her throat, ready to speak the words that would change everything. I've called this meeting to announce some significant changes in leadership, Lillian began, her voice calm but unwavering. Ethan, seated to her right, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Jessica, across the table, kept her gaze focused on the papers in front of her. But the tension was palpable. Lillian could feel their discomfort, their unease like animals sensing danger in the air. I've been watching the direction the company has been taking, Lillian continued, her gaze sweeping across the board members, and I can no longer ignore what's happening. Her eyes briefly met Ethan's, who was now leaning forward, his jaw tightening. Ethan's voice broke the silence, a sharp edge to it. What are you talking about? I've been running this company. You wanted me to take over. Lillian raised a hand, cutting him off. That's exactly the problem, Ethan. You've been running things, but you've lost sight of what truly matters. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. This company was built on respect, hard work, and a deep understanding of what it takes to lead. You've allowed it to slip, and I will no longer stand by. Ethan's eyes narrowed. What are you saying? I'm saying that you're no longer the CEO of this company, Lillian said, her words quiet but cutting through the air like a knife. A stunned silence fell over the room. Ethan's face turned red, disbelief flashing across his features. You can't do that, he spat, standing up abruptly. I built this company with you. You taught me how to do this. Lillian met his gaze, unwavering. You may have learned the mechanics of running the business, but you've lost the heart of it. You've surrounded yourself with people who only reinforce your delusions of control. People like Jessica, she said, her gaze now shifting to the executive sitting across from Ethan. Jessica's face paled. What's this about, Lillian? She demanded, her voice sharp but betraying a flicker of fear. We've both been working hard for this company's success. Success? Lillian echoed, her voice low. You've been manipulating things from behind the scenes. Using Ethan's position to advance your own interests. That ends today. Ethan's hands slammed down on the table. I earned this. You can't just take it from me. I've done everything you asked. No, Ethan. Lillian cut in, her voice icy. You haven't. And I'm not asking you. I'm telling you. She looked to the board members, who were all staring at her, their faces a mixture of shock and confusion. I'm removing both of you from your positions, effective immediately. The room was still. No one moved. Ethan's face was a mixture of rage and disbelief. You don't have the right to do this. I do, Lillian replied calmly, her gaze unwavering. This is my company, and I built it with my hands. If you think you can take that from me, you're wrong. Ethan stood there, fists clenched, his chest heaving with anger. Jessica remained silent, her face pale, her eyes wide with the realization of what was happening. The ripple effects of Lillian's decision were already beginning to spread, the shock wave of it all hanging in the air. She had made her move, and there was no going back now. The phone buzzed on Lillian's desk, but she didn't pick it up. Instead, she stared out the window, the weight of the moment pressing on her chest. The board meeting had ended, but the room was still alive with the echoes of her decision. Removing Ethan, stripping Jessica of her power, it felt right. But the silence that followed felt deafening. Lillian's office door creaked open, and David stepped in. His face was drawn, concern etched into his features, but there was something more in his eyes. It wasn't just worry, it was the recognition of how deeply this moment would affect everything. You good? He asked, his voice low, watching her closely. Lillian didn't look away from the window. I will be, she replied, her voice steady but carrying a weight she couldn't shake. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to focus. It's just beginning, though. The fallout will be worse than I expected. David stepped closer, leaning against the edge of the desk. The board's already murmuring. They're not happy with the way you've handled this. Some are even questioning your judgment. Lillian's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. She could feel the shifts in the air, the undercurrents of discontent swirling around her company. But this was the cost of her decision. She had to do what was right for the business, no matter the price. Ethan's already spinning this as a personal attack, David continued. He's trying to convince the rest of the board that you're doing this out of spite. Lillian's eyes narrowed. Let him. Let him paint himself into a corner. His desperation will undo him. David studied her, his gaze softening with concern. And the employees? Them too, Lillian said, exhaling sharply. They're nervous. I can feel the tension in the halls. They know something's off. Her gaze drifted to the door, to the rest of the company outside. I'll give them time, but they need to know the truth. David hesitated, clearly weighing his words. And Sophie? You're shielding her from all of this, right? Lillian nodded, her heart aching at the thought of her granddaughter. She doesn't need to be part of this chaos. Not yet. Not until she's ready to understand. Sophie had always been the light in her life. She couldn't let her grow up in the shadow of this mess. There was a long pause before David spoke again. Lillian, this is going to get harder before it gets better. Ethan won't go down quietly, and Jessica, she won't let this slide either. I know, Lillian said softly, but I've spent my entire life building this. I'm not letting anyone destroy it. David stood up straight, his expression solemn but supportive. I'll be here. You don't have to do this alone. Lillian looked at him, and for the first time in hours, a small, quiet sense of relief settled over her. Thank you, David. But this is my fight now. The weight of her decision still pressed on her, but there was no turning back. The storm had only just begun, and Lillian Wright was ready to weather it. The days following Lillian's decision were filled with whispers and tension. The company was not immune to the shockwaves of her actions, and soon enough, Ethan and Jessica's retaliation began. It started quietly, in hushed conversations behind closed doors, but the storm was gathering force. Lillian was in her office, reviewing the latest financials, when David knocked and entered without waiting for an invitation. He looked more tired than usual, his brow furrowed with concern. Things are escalating, David said, his voice low as he closed the door behind him. Ethan's been meeting with the other executives. He's trying to rally support. Lillian didn't look up from the report in front of her. Let him. He won't succeed. David sighed, leaning against the desk. You know how this goes. He's not going to back down quietly. He's questioning your competence, Lillian. The decisions you made, the way you handled everything, he's framing it as rash and emotionally driven. Lillian set the report aside and met David's eyes. Let him talk. The truth will speak for itself. I know, David said, but his gaze softened with concern. But it's not just about Ethan. Jessica's been stirring the pot, too. She's been undermining you in subtle ways, whispering in the ears of those who were loyal to her. If she succeeds, the company will fragment. They'll convince enough people to doubt your leadership. Lillian's lips pressed into a thin line. She had known this was coming. Ethan's reaction had been predictable, but Jessica's quiet manipulation cut deeper. Lillian had trusted her, believed she could be an ally. Now, it seemed she had been wrong. I won't engage in their petty games, Lillian said firmly, standing up and walking to the window. I've done this for too long to let them. Break me now. David nodded but remained silent for a moment. The employees are nervous, Lillian. You're going to have to show them you can lead, that you can weather this storm. If you don't— I know, Lillian cut him off, her voice steady but firm. I'll show them. I've always shown them. The door to the office opened again, and one of Lillian's trusted managers stepped in. We've got a problem, she said, her voice tense. A few of the executives are questioning your judgment again. They're gathering, trying to figure out what the next step is. They're looking for weaknesses. Lillian straightened, her expression hardening. I'm not giving them any. Tell them to keep working. The company is strong. Let them see that. As the day passed, Lillian met with key stakeholders, reaffirming her commitment to the company's success and growth. The tension was palpable, but Lillian remained composed, her focus unwavering. She refused to allow Ethan and Jessica's machinations to distract her from what she had spent her life building. She would not allow their petty games to tear down everything she had worked for. David was there by her side, acting as a buffer between Lillian and the executives loyal to Ethan. He fielded the questions, deflected the subtle challenges, and kept the most vocal of the dissenters at bay. Lillian didn't need to engage directly. She had nothing to prove to them. The business spoke for itself. But the air around the office was thick with uncertainty. Every decision Lillian made seemed to have a ripple effect. And no matter how many victories she secured, it felt like there was always another battle waiting. Later that afternoon, as Lillian stood in the corner of the boardroom during a meeting with key stakeholders, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She excused herself, stepping out into the hallway, her pulse quickening as she checked the message. It was from David. Ethan's pushing for a vote of no confidence. It's happening sooner than we thought. Lillian's heart skipped a beat. She had expected this, but not so soon. The fight for control of the company was no longer in the shadows. It was coming to a head. She stood in the hallway, the weight of what was coming pressing heavily on her chest. This was the moment of truth. Would her leadership hold? Would the company she had built endure? She straightened, her back stiffening with determination. She would not let them take it from her. The storm was at her door, and she was ready to face it head on. Ethan stormed into Lillian's office, his face flushed with fury. His footsteps echoed in the silence, the tension between them palpable. You've destroyed everything, he spat, voice cracking with raw emotion. The company, the family, everything we built. All of it gone. And for what? To prove a point? Lillian didn't flinch. She remained seated, her hands resting calmly on the desk. She had known this moment was coming. Ethan's anger had been building for weeks, and now it was here. I didn't destroy anything, Ethan, Lillian said softly, but firmly. You did. You've let your pride, your arrogance, blind you to what really matters. This company, our family, it's all been sacrificed for what? Power? Control? Ethan's face twisted with frustration, his fists clenched at his sides. You pushed me into this. You always told me I had to take control, to step up. And now you're punishing me for it. His voice shook with anger. I earned this. I proved I could do it. And you? He cut himself off, pacing in front of her. Lillian watched him quietly, letting his words wash over her without reacting. She knew this wasn't just about the company anymore. It was about Ethan's fear of failure, his desperate need for validation. And it was about the damage done to their relationship, the one thing she hadn't anticipated losing. "Ethan," she said, her voice calm, "this wasn't about you proving anything to me. You were given a chance to lead, and you took it, but you failed. You surrounded yourself with people who only told you what you wanted to hear. You didn't respect the company, the legacy. You didn't even respect yourself." His eyes widened, and he stepped forward, his voice shaking. "I'm your son. How can you say that? You're throwing me out like I'm nothing." Lillian stood slowly, her gaze steady. "You've never understood, Ethan. This wasn't just about taking charge. It was about respect. Respect for the business. Respect for the people who built it. You've ignored that. You've let others pull you in the wrong direction." Before Ethan could respond, the door opened. Jessica stepped into the room, her presence as calculated as ever. "Lillian, you need to stop," she said, her voice smooth but laced with a thin layer of tension. "You're making a mistake. The company is falling apart without us. You can't just—" Lillian cut her off with a sharp glance. "You're part of the problem, Jessica. You've been manipulating everything behind the scenes, using Ethan for your own gain. I won't let you undermine what I've built any longer." Jessica's face turned pale, but she held her ground. "You don't understand, Lillian. We're just trying to help. You're pushing us out, and you're going to ruin everything." Ethan's anger boiled over again. "This isn't just business, it's family." Lillian's expression softened slightly, but her voice remained steady. "Family doesn't come above respect, Ethan. I've spent my life building this, and if you truly understood that, you wouldn't be here, trying to tear it all down." For a moment, Ethan stood there, speechless. His anger had subsided, replaced by something deeper doubt. The reality of the situation was beginning to sink in. Lillian took a step forward, her tone firm but not unkind. "You don't deserve this company yet, Ethan. Maybe one day you will. But for now, this is mine to protect." Ethan's shoulders slumped. He didn't say anything else. Jessica, too, fell silent, her gaze shifting between them, the weight of the moment settling in. Lillian looked at both of them, the quiet tension thick in the room. The storm had come, but now the calm had arrived. Whether or not they could rebuild the shattered pieces of their family and their company remained to be seen. But Lillian had made her stand, and she would protect what was hers. In the days following Lillian's final confrontation with Ethan and Jessica, the company began to recover under her steady leadership. The board members who had once hesitated now followed her lead, sensing her unwavering commitment to the company's future. Ethan's attempts to things fell flat, his influence quickly waning as the truth of his actions became clearer. Lillian didn't waste time. She took immediate action, cutting ties with the remaining loyalists to Ethan and Jessica. Executives who had been complicit in undermining her were quietly let go. There was no room for weakness in the company's future. Lillian wasn't interested in retribution, but she knew she couldn't let the old guard hold her back. Jessica, ever the schemer, had tried to rally support behind the scenes, but Lillian was one step ahead. She dismissed Jessica from her position, citing her manipulation and lack of transparency. The process was swift, and Jessica's departure, though initially fiery, was handled with efficiency. Her influence evaporated, and her allies scattered. With the old leadership gone, Lillian turned her focus to rebuilding. She surrounded herself with trusted individuals, assembling a new leadership team that shared her values of integrity and respect. The company, once fractured, was now united under Lillian's steady hand. She reestablished the core principles that had made the company successful in the first place: transparency, respect, and a commitment to excellence. In her meetings with key stakeholders, Lillian's resolve shone through. She addressed their concerns with clarity, laying out a clear vision for the future. There were still lingering doubts, but with each passing day, the company's direction became clearer. It wasn't just about surviving the storm, it was about thriving in the aftermath. Ethan, meanwhile, began to fade from the spotlight. His efforts to rally support failed, and he was left to reflect on his actions. For the first time, Lillian saw the cracks in his facade. The anger had subsided, replaced by a quieter, more introspective Ethan. Whether he would ever accept his role in the company's future remained uncertain, but Lillian knew she had done what was best for the business, even if it meant severing ties with her son. The media caught wind of the drama, and headlines swirled around the company's internal turmoil. Some painted Lillian as a ruthless matriarch, while others hailed her for restoring order. But Lillian remained indifferent to the outside noise. She knew the company's success spoke louder than any headline ever could. As the dust settled, Lillian met with her new leadership team to map out the company's path forward. The storm had passed, but the work was just beginning. The company's future was in her hands, and she was ready to lead it into a new era. Lillian glanced out the window, a quiet sense of peace washing over her. She had weathered the storm and she had emerged stronger than ever. The company, her legacy, was safe, and it always would be. The company had begun to heal, but Lillian knew it would take more than just time to restore the trust and morale that had been shattered. The days of instability were behind them, but the true work had only just begun. The new leadership team was strong-focused, determined, and loyal to the company's core values, but Lillian knew the company's heart was its people. Rebuilding those relationships would be her top priority. Lillian sat in her office one afternoon, reviewing quarterly projections, but her thoughts were elsewhere. She turned her chair toward the window, watching the workers in the courtyard below. The hum of activity outside a stark contrast to the stillness she often felt within. The business was on the rise again, but she knew there was an emotional gap to bridge, particularly with her employees. Everything's moving in the right direction. David's voice broke into her thoughts. He had been by her side throughout it all, a steadying force amid the storm. He stood in the doorway now, his arms crossed casually, though his eyes were sharp with concern. But it's not just about the numbers. You've got to reconnect with them. Show them you're still the leader they can trust. Lillian sighed, her fingers drumming on the armrest. I know. I've been so focused on making sure the ship stays afloat, I haven't thought about how they're feeling. It's been a rough ride for everyone, David agreed. They need to see that the heart of this company is intact, that it's still about the people, the team. Lillian stood and walked over to the large glass window, looking down at the office floor below. It will take time, but I'll make sure they understand that I'm in this with them. As the weeks passed, Lillian worked tirelessly to rebuild those lost connections. She held meetings, not just with the leadership team, but with employees at every level. She asked questions, listened intently, and made sure they knew their voices were heard. She wanted them to see that her decision wasn't just about her, it was about the company, its future, and its values. The company's success wasn't just a reflection of her leadership anymore, it was a collective effort. Together, they had weathered the storm, and now, together, they would thrive. To celebrate this newfound unity, Lillian decided to host a company-wide gathering. The event was a blend of business and camaraderie, held in one of the company's newly renovated conference spaces. It was elegant but understated, just like Lillian. There was no grand, over-the-top celebration. This was about forging new connections and reminding everyone why they were there, working side by side. Lillian stood at the front of the room, watching her employees mingle, the air charged with an energy she hadn't seen in a long time. Sophie, now 15, was at her side. Her granddaughter had become a familiar presence in the office since Lillian had made the decision to shield her from the family's chaos. But now, Sophie was more involved. She watched Lillian with wide eyes, taking in the confidence with which her grandmother moved through the crowd, greeting everyone, leading the charge. As Lillian spoke to the group, Sophie's admiration for her grandmother deepened. The business world was no longer a mystery to her. It was something she wanted to be a part of. Lillian had always made it clear that Sophie could do anything she set her mind to. But now, it was becoming real. Sophie wasn't just witnessing Lillian's leadership. She was learning from it. Lillian's words were short and sweet, but powerful. This company is about more than just profit. It's about collaboration, trust, and respect. It's about building something that lasts. And I believe with all of you here, we can do just that. The applause that followed felt genuine. Lillian looked around the room, a quiet sense of pride swelling within her. The company was thriving once again. It wasn't just about business anymore, it was about creating a legacy. As the evening wound down, the media took notice. The headlines didn't surprise Lillian. Some hailed her for her resilience, for being a strong woman in a cutthroat world. Others criticized her decision to take control, painting her as a ruthless matriarch. But it didn't matter. The company was back on track, and that was all she cared about. Later that night, as Lillian and Sophie sat in the quiet of her office, Lillian reflected on everything she had endured. Ethan had faded from the scene, choosing to forge his own path, far from the family business. His departure, though difficult, had allowed Lillian to focus on what mattered most: her company, her legacy, and now, her granddaughter. Sophie looked up at Lillian, her eyes bright with determination. "Grandma," she said softly, "when it's my turn to lead, I want to do it just like you." Lillian smiled, her heart full. "You will, Sophie. You'll do it even better." The future was no longer a question. It was clear. Lillian had weathered the storm, rebuilt her empire, and in the process, had found a new purpose to pass the torch to the next generation. Lillian sat in her office, the dim light of the late afternoon casting long shadows across the room. She stared out the window at the city skyline, the world outside moving with the pulse of life while inside, she was focused on something deeper, her legacy. The company had stabilized, but she couldn't shake the thought that lingered in her mind. What would happen after her? The business was strong again, but Lillian knew that what mattered most now was securing its future. Ensuring it wasn't just a business that survived her, but a legacy that lived on through someone who would carry it forward. Her gaze shifted to the desk before her, where a leather-bound journal lay open. She had been writing her plan, the one that would guide Sophie in taking the reins when the time was right. Sophie had always been bright, determined, but now she was starting to show the qualities of a leader in her own right. Lillian had always believed in Sophie, her instincts, her drive, her unshakable respect for the business, but the question now was Sophie ready to take over? Lillian had written everything out, from the lessons learned to the core values of the company. Her hand moved confidently over the paper as she described the responsibility of leadership: trust, vision, and sacrifice. She paused, glancing at the door when she heard a light knock. Sophie stepped in, her eyes wide with excitement, her face glowing with the ambition Lillian had once shared at her age. "Grandma," Sophie said, her voice full of determination, "I've been thinking. I want to learn everything. I want to take on this company when you're ready. And I want to do it my way, but like you, strong and with purpose." Lillian smiled softly, the pride in her heart swelling. Sophie wasn't just watching. She was understanding. She wasn't merely a bystander anymore, she was becoming part of the vision, the future. "I've been writing it all down, Sophie," Lillian said, motioning to the journal. "The plan for you when the time comes. I want you to lead with respect for the people, the company, and its history. And I want you to always remember this. It's not just about business. It's about the relationships you build, the trust you nurture." Sophie nodded, her hands gently closing the journal. "I'm ready. I want to make sure this company continues to grow and be everything you've built it to be." Lillian felt a quiet peace settle over her. She'd been through the fire, the chaos, and the heartbreak. Ethan was distant now, carving out his own life, leaving behind a fractured relationship that had no easy resolution. But in that moment, Lillian realized something that had always been there. Sophie was the future she had fought for. She was everything Lillian had hoped for: resilient, smart, and full of heart. Later, as the evening wound down, Lillian received a message from a reporter. "The business community looks to you as a beacon of strength, a woman who not only built a legacy but is passing it on." But Lillian's thoughts weren't on the media or public recognition. They were on Sophie. The future was hers to shape, and Lillian had ensured that Sophie would be ready when the time came. She smiled softly as Sophie came to stand beside her, already looking toward the horizon. The storm had passed. The legacy was secure. The company had flourished under Lillian's leadership, but the time had come for her to step back. Her work wasn't finished, not by a long shot, but her role in the day-to-day operations was evolving. As Sophie continued to take on more responsibility, Lillian could feel the shift slow at first, but now undeniable. It was time for the next chapter. Lillian sat in her office, the city skyline stretching out before her like an endless horizon. Her fingers traced the rim of her coffee cup, but her thoughts were far away. She had spent decades building this empire, navigating through storms and challenges, yet now she found herself preparing for something different. Sophie had proven herself time and again handling major meetings, making tough decisions, gaining the trust of employees who once questioned her youth. Lillian watched with quiet pride as her granddaughter became the leader she had always hoped for. Sophie wasn't just managing the business. She was shaping it, bringing fresh ideas while staying grounded in the core values that had made the company what it was. Lillian felt a tug of nostalgia as she looked at the papers on her desk. She'd been writing the next chapter for the company, leaving behind not just documents and plans, but the essence of the culture she had built. She'd trusted Sophie with it. She'd built the foundation, and now it was Sophie's turn to build the future. Sophie's ready, Lillian thought to herself, a soft smile crossing her lips. There was no more doubt. She had done everything she could. The rest was up to Sophie, and Lillian could finally take the step back she so richly deserved. But it wasn't all about the company anymore. Lillian was learning how to enjoy the fruits of her labor. She was no longer bound by the constraints of running the business day to day. Instead, she found herself traveling more, visiting cities she'd only heard of, speaking at conferences where women in business shared their stories. It was at one of those conferences, in New York City, that Lillian felt the full weight of what she had accomplished. She stood before a crowd of hundreds of women, young, eager, full of ambition, and she shared her story. Her journey was no longer just about the business. It was about empowering others, showing them what was possible when you refused to give up, even when the world told you no. The applause that followed her speech was deafening, and for the first time in years, Lillian felt truly appreciated, not as a CEO or matriarch, but as a woman who had fought and won. She had built something that would outlast her, something that would continue to inspire long after she was gone. Back at the office, Sophie was growing into her role. Lillian could sense the shift in the air when she walked into the building. The employees were more engaged, the energy lighter, but there was also a quiet respect. Sophie wasn't just Lillian's granddaughter anymore. She was the future of the company. And as Lillian watched Sophie in the boardroom, taking the lead with ease, she felt a wave of relief wash over her. Ethan, too, had found his own way. He had started his own business venture, separate from the family. The media had painted it as a failure, but Lillian knew better. Ethan had made his choices, and now he was carving out his own path. She had no illusions about the relationship they would ever have, but she was no longer invested in fixing it. It was his journey now. Lillian's family, though fractured in some ways, had come to accept this new phase of her life. They supported her, but Lillian no longer depended on them for validation. She had become her own source of strength, her own sense of worth. It had taken a long time to get there, but she had finally arrived. One evening, as Lillian sat in a hotel room in Chicago, staring out at the glittering lights of the city below, she reflected on the road that had led her here. She had built a company, yes, but she had also built something more. A life. A life full of purpose, lessons, challenges, and triumphs. And as she sipped her drink, a contented smile crept onto her face. The future was in good hands. Sophie was ready to lead, and Lillian had done her part. But there was still one last thing left to do: enjoy the life she had fought for, knowing it would live on in the hands of the next generation. The journey was complete. Lillian sat quietly in the back of the grand auditorium, the noise of the graduation ceremony fading into a hum around her. The light from the stage cast a warm glow across the crowd, but Lillian's attention was solely on Sophie, standing among her peers, proud and poised, ready to take the next step into the world. It was an end, of sorts, but more than that, it was a beginning. Lillian had always known this day would come, the day Sophie would graduate from college, but it didn't stop the wave of emotion that crested in her chest. The little girl she had watched grow into a woman was now standing at the threshold of the rest of her life. Lillian's journey wasn't over, but this chapter was. She had guided Sophie, mentored her, but now Sophie would be the one forging her own path. As the ceremony progressed, Lillian found herself reflecting on everything that had led them here. Her thoughts turned to Ethan, to the fractured relationship they now shared. He had made his choices, and those choices had led him down a path that was vastly different from the one Sophie was about to take. Lillian had always believed in the importance of integrity, of leading with honesty, of respecting not just the work, but the people you worked with. Ethan, despite his early potential, had lacked that foundation. His business, which he had poured his soul into, was now struggling. The cracks in his leadership were beginning to show. Lillian knew that he had never truly understood what it took to build something lasting, not just in terms of success, but in the way you treat others along the way. Sophie's business acumen had always been sharper than Ethan's, but now it was more than that. Lillian had instilled in Sophie not just the tools for success, but the understanding that integrity, respect, and fairness were just as important as profit margins and quarterly reports. Sophie had learned early on that leadership wasn't about being the loudest in the room. It was about listening, learning, and empowering others. As the ceremony drew to a close, Lillian stood, her heart swelling with pride, and clapped as Sophie walked across the stage to accept her diploma. The applause around her was a blur, the faces of the other parents and students a blur. But Lillian's focus was entirely on Sophie, the young woman she had raised, taught, and loved. Later that evening, the family gathered for a quiet celebration at Lillian's home. Ethan had been invited but hadn't come. He had been busy with his struggling business, trying to make it work, trying to prove something to himself. Lillian had stopped trying to fix their relationship. It was a broken puzzle she no longer needed to solve. Sophie was the future, and Lillian was content knowing that she had passed on everything she knew, everything she had worked for. As they sat around the dinner table, Sophie turned to Lillian, her eyes shining with both gratitude and determination. "Grandma," she said, "I want to lead this company in a way that honors everything you've taught me. I want to do it with integrity, just like you." Lillian smiled, the pride in her heart palpable. "You'll do it even better, Sophie. Remember, it's not just about building something that lasts. It's about building something that matters. To the people you lead, to the community you serve." Sophie nodded, "Herr Anwavering. I won't forget." Lillian reached across the table, taking Sophie's hand in hers, a quiet connection between them that spoke volumes. There was still much work to be done, but Lillian knew that Sophie was ready. The company, her legacy, was in good hands. As the evening wore on and the laughter of her family filled the air, Lillian allowed herself a moment of peace. She had fought, built, and weathered the storms. And now, she was passing the torch to Sophie, knowing that she had created something far more lasting than a business. She had built a legacy of leadership, integrity, and love. The future was no longer a question. It was certain, and Lillian could finally rest, knowing she had done her part. Lillian sat quietly in the back row of the auditorium, her eyes fixed on Sophie as she walked across the stage to accept her diploma. The ceremony buzzed around her, but Lillian's focus was solely on her granddaughter, the young woman she had mentored, guided, and loved. This was a moment she had been waiting for, but it still took her breath away. The culmination of years of hard work, sacrifice, and love. Sophie had made it. She thought back to the early days, when Sophie was just a child, always curious, always eager to learn. Lillian had seen the spark in her, the same spark that had driven her to build the company. But now, Sophie was stepping into her own, ready to take on the world with her own vision, her own leadership, and Lillian knew, without a doubt, that it was time to step back. As the ceremony ended, Lillian stood, clapping proudly as Sophie joined her family. The applause seemed to fade into the background as Sophie approached, her eyes shining with a mixture of pride and excitement. "Grandma," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. "I did it." "You did," Lillian said softly, reaching out to embrace her. And you're just getting started. That evening, the family gathered at Lillian's home for a quiet celebration. The house was filled with warmth, laughter, and love. But there was something bittersweet in the air, something Lillian could feel deep in her bones. Ethan had chosen not to attend. His own business venture, though struggling, had become his focus. It had been hard to let go of the hopes she had once held for him, but she no longer tried to fix what was broken. The fractured relationship between them remained, but Lillian had learned to accept it. The past couldn't be changed. What mattered now was the future, and Sophie was the future. Around the dinner table, Sophie turned to Lillian. I want to lead the company the way you taught me. With integrity, with vision, and with respect for everyone who helped us get here. Lillian smiled, her heart swelling with pride. You will, Sophie. And you'll do it even better than I did. Just remember, leadership isn't about being the loudest voice. It's about listening, learning, and always, always respecting the people who help you build. Sophie nodded, her expression serious, but there was a spark of determination in her eyes. Lillian knew that Sophie was ready. She was more than ready. The company was in good hands. Later that night, Lillian found herself alone in her study, reflecting on the journey she had taken. The company was thriving again, the future secure. She had built something lasting, not just a business, but a legacy of leadership, integrity, and compassion. And now, she could finally rest, knowing that Sophie would carry it forward, shaping it in her own image. The world was waiting for Sophie, and Lillian was content to watch as she stepped into the role she was born to fill. The future had arrived, and it was bright. Lillian sat on the balcony of her penthouse, her fingers tracing the edge of her coffee mug, a distant smile playing on her lips as she looked out over the city. The skyline, once a symbol of the battles she had fought, now felt like a quiet reflection of everything she had built. The years of struggle, the moments of doubt, the sacrifices it had all led here to this moment of peace. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the mug, but it wasn't from age or weakness. It was from the weight of it all, the legacy she had created, the lessons she had imparted, and the knowledge that her time in the trenches was over. Sophie was ready. The company, the empire Lillian had spent decades constructing, was no longer hers alone to steer. She had given everything, poured her soul into it, and now Sophie, with her drive and integrity, was prepared to carry it forward. As Lillian gazed out at the glowing horizon, memories flooded back. The early days, when she had to fight for every step, every inch of respect. There had been days when the weight of the world seemed unbearable, when betrayal and disappointment threatened to consume her. Ethan's arrogance, the harsh words, the fractured relationship, it had all hurt deeply. Yet, through it all, she had never given up. She had rebuilt herself from the ashes, just as she had rebuilt the business after every setback. She had learned the power of resilience, of rebuilding not just the structure around you, but the strength within. Lillian's reflection was interrupted by the sound of a soft knock at the door. Sophie entered, her presence filling the room with a quiet energy. Lillian looked at her granddaughter, standing confidently by the door. Sophie's eyes had that same fire Lillian had seen in herself years ago, strong, determined, but tempered with wisdom. It was the perfect balance. "Grandma," Sophie said, her voice steady, "I wanted to talk to you about the future, about how we're going to expand into international markets. I think we're ready to make the leap, but I want your thoughts." Lillian smiled, the pride in her heart overwhelming. Sophie had learned so much, but it was the respect Sophie had for the people around her, the empathy with which she led, that made Lillian the proudest. The business was in good hands, Sophie's hands. "You're ready," Lillian said simply. "You always have been." Sophie stepped forward, sitting beside Lillian, the two of them looking out at the same skyline. The future stretched out before them. "I don't think I could have gotten here without you," Sophie continued. "You taught me everything. How to stand firm in the face of adversity. How to lead with both strength and kindness." Lillian's voice softened, but there was no mistaking the conviction in her words. "You've always had it in you, Sophie. I just showed you the way." The two sat in silence for a while, watching the last light of day slip behind the horizon. the sky turning dark but full of promise. Lillian's life had been a journey of challenges and triumphs, but the real reward wasn't in the company, the wealth, or the recognition. It was in knowing that she had built something meaningful, a business that would continue to thrive long after she was gone. And, perhaps most importantly, she had built a life worth living, one that embodied strength, integrity, and resilience. As Lillian reflected on the path she had walked, she knew that her true legacy lay not in the company itself, but in the values she had passed on. She had lived a life true to her principles, and now Sophie would carry that torch. It was a full circle moment, the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The world had tried to break her, but she had stood firm. Now, she could rest easy, knowing that the lessons she had imparted would live on in Sophie's leadership, in the company's continued growth, and in the hearts of the many women she had inspired along the way. Sophie turned to her, a quiet understanding between them. "We'll make sure it lasts, Grandma. Just like you always wanted." Lillian smiled, her heart full. "I built a company, but more importantly, I built a life worth living." And as she sat there, watching Sophie take the first steps into her future, Lillian knew she had done everything she set out to do. The journey was complete, and the future was brighter than ever.